Welcome to the Eric Brady podcast, Series 1, Adolf Hitler, His Bombers and Me. Episode 16, Meanwhile in London. Eric, you were evacuated from London in September 1939 when the war started and didn't return until September 1942. What happened during that period of 3 years in London and in the wider world as the war developed?
The Germans were successful in their attacks on France very quickly, in fact. And then we had Dunkirk in August 1940. As they were putting up defences on the beaches against invasion at the time after the Germans invaded France in May 1940, we were evacuated from Folkestone to Tredegar, and Germany occupied the whole of France in the end. And there were a lot of bombing raids around, but it was on the 7th of September 1940 that the Blitz really began. And William Shearer, in his book, The Rise and Fall of the Third Reich, records that on that first day, 625 bombers, escorted by 648 fighters, bombed London in successive waves as they came across. And then the first wave that had dropped their bombs returned to the French airfields that the Germans had taken over and had established, refueled, rebombed, and came back again. And so constantly the bombers were raining down their bombs, and that lasted from the 7th of September into November, when the bombing was coming over day and night. And then after November 1940, it was more concentrated on nighttime raids. On that first time raid, the London Fire Brigade managed to record where every bomb fell. And one bomb, an incendiary, fell on Sandhurst Road School, and it destroyed an RAF mess on the premises and also a store with a lot of bomb aiming equipment. And so, of course, these schools, which had been emptied by the evacuation, were taken over by many ministries. And so German intelligence would have learned that and understood it, and perhaps that was, probably a factor in deciding them to bomb 6 schools much later. Also, at that time, the Germans dropped a bomb, which actually was a sea mine, to which they attached parachutes and chucked those out of the bombers coming over. And that fell on the block of flats immediately behind our house. And when I eventually went home, it was completely flattened. That was partly because apparently the sea mine had crashed right through the roof of the block of flats and then had exploded inside and obviously had blasted out everything. There may not have been all that many casualties. I've not been able to find this out, because shelters were also built, communal shelters, in a green space between 2 streets of blocks of flats for the inhabitants to go into them. And so possibly most, if not all, of the people who lived in those flats were actually in the shelters at the time, as my mother was. With the bombing of the docks so much, my father was in constant danger as well, because he was a lorry driver for NAFI, and he was constantly going there for supplies to take to warehouses and to army and air force and naval camps that were springing up around the country.
Do you remember any bombing raids when you were back at home?
Yes, towards the end of the year, after I was home in September 1942, there came what was called the mini blitz, when they decided to go for London again, but with fewer bombers. But there was still a raid with 120 bombers on one occasion. And then I remember the time coming up towards Christmas that the air raid sirens went one night, and we were all sleeping in our beds in the house because the shelter hadn't been used for a long time. And then suddenly my door opened, and I could hear in the distance what sounded like thunder that kept on and on and on and on, not like an ordinary thunderstorm. And then suddenly the siren went at the foot of our road at the warden's post. And my mother came into our room and said, "Get your clothes, bring all your bedclothes downstairs. The bombers have come back." And we three kids went downstairs, half asleep, carrying our clothes and our bedding, and found that our mother had pushed the table against the inner wall, and she said, "Let's put the bedclothes under there to lie on and shelter under there." And then we could hear nearby guns banging away, the anti-aircraft guns, and we huddled under there, under the table, Kitty, Eddie, my mother and myself. And my dad was away on an overnight trip with Naffy, and we huddled there. Kitty said, "Well, why not go to the shelter?" And her mother said that the trouble was we hadn't been down there for ages. We had no idea what condition it was in, and it would be as cold as icicles. So we'd better stay where we were. And eventually the all clear went, but my mother said we'd better stay under the table in case they bombers came back. I don't recall if they did that night, but they did on successive nights in what was called a mini blitz, and a number of children were re-evacuated. Kitty had wondered if, with the bombing restarting, if we would be re-evacuated, and so she could go back to her foster parents and their nice locality, but we weren't allowed to go back. So after that first raid, I was very keen to go out shrapnel hunting, which of course was the main interest of particularly boys after a bombing raid. The shrapnel was usually fragments of anti-aircraft shells that had, of course, exploded in the air to bring down the aircraft. But when they exploded, the bits of shells fell down to earth, and those were our bits of shrapnel. We were also warned as children that if we saw a toy in the street, do not pick it up, because the story went, the German Air Force, the Luftwaffe, would drop toys that actually had explosives in, so that when the British children picked up the toys with the bombs inside, so they get their hands blown off. I never found any toys like that. I never met anyone who had found a toy like that. And I don't even know if the story was true, but it was widely believed. So we kids were wary of picking up things that could have been toys that could have contained bombs. Not that we ever found any.
To buy your copy of Adolf Hitler, His Bombers and Me to read alongside the series, go to ericbradybooks.co.uk. The Eric Brady podcast can be found on YouTube, podcast services, and at ericbrady.blogspot.com.